editor, and just to give us a flavour of what the SABC's approach is to how we deal with stories and their treatment. Thanks very much for joining us, Sis Thandeka.
Thank you for having me.
So, as we heard from Owen Bryce-Peace's report, being a journalist is quite a tough thing these days. We're learning about people even being killed, thousands of journalists being killed since 2006 and so on. It's a very difficult terrain, and of course more recently here in South Africa we saw our competitor make a decision to withdraw from the EFF conference because of some of the utterances of the leadership and so on. What should be the journalistic standard in terms of approaching stories which are controversial, particularly political?
Oh, that's a few questions in one. Let me just start by saying that today is an important day globally to examine issues of media freedom. And the global and the international press are examining these in a spirit of self-criticism and in an analytical way, as well as looking at the threats to this hard-won public right and it's a constitutional right in many countries, including our own, to media freedom. Now, with the rise of populism throughout the world, we are seeing a direct link between the attacks on journalism and the attacks on individual journalists and media houses with the rise in populist movements. Now, the rise in populist movements has seen a bit of a boom since the downturn in 2008. When there are economic crises, when there is a recessionary climate and there is economic gloom, populist movements normally take legitimate concerns about benefits for the ordinary people and elevate these, and as these should, and they use these to rise to power, and they create a symbiotic relationship between the press and populism. The EU has distributed a video for journalists and members of society about the symbiotic relationship between the rise of populism and our coverage of those. Today, in the Daily Maverick, which is the media house at the center of the storm in South Africa, including ENCA, the lead story is precisely about the rise of populism in South Africa and how the media has handled this. Now, given that populism is likely to rise and our economic fortunes are unlikely to just take off tomorrow, a battle is predicted, even in the Daily Maverick this morning, between the media and the populist movement.
So what do we do as the public broadcaster in terms of this terrain that we're in? How should we proceed?
This week we've had occasion as the public broadcaster, some of us who are journalists in this house, who had opportunity to look at the mandate again. The mandate is very visionary. It's a guide for all times, in that it says to us that we must uphold the public's right to know, which is a constitutional right, and we must uphold the Section 16 rights, the right to freedom of expression, the right to freedom of speech, the right to intellectual inquiry, freedom of the press. And in upholding these rights, we must tend towards an anti-censorship stance. So, for example, we would not advocate pulling out of the coverage of an EFF conference precisely because the public needs to know about people who enjoy the electoral mandate of upwards of 8% of the South African population.
Yes.
We don't exist as a public broadcaster to adjudicate subjective political rights and wrongs. We exist to provide a universal access to the platforms of public broadcasting, which are owned by the South African people collectively.
Of course, that makes sense. I mean, the EFF is an elected party. It got about 8% of the vote and 11% of the vote, actually.
Yes.
And so obviously we would have to reflect the representations that come from them. But what about parties like BLF, that it was, but it isn't anymore? What kind of regard do we give to an organization like that?
We have to give them some regard, especially because they raise issues that are of public interest. And public interest is one of the guiding principles of news values. If something is in the public interest and an issue is sufficiently important to the public, then we have an obligation to cover that. Besides, our mandate is about accommodating everyone, even bringing out into the open disaffected voices that are on the margins of our society and interrogating that which those voices have to say for us, for posterity, for the future. And that, in effect, is the essence of what we do here. And of course, we've got the usual journalistic mandates like truth, factuality, accuracy, timeliness, and so it's an onerous mandate to carry.
Yes.
But it's, I think, one of the most important and one of the most glorious in the South African media space.
How important is it in a world where news is very fast and, you know, people are breaking news on Twitter and so on? How important is it for us as the SABC, the public broadcaster, when we get an email or a tweet, for us to verify that information before we put it out? Because obviously there's always that thing that you want to be the first with information.
Along with the rise of populism has been the rise of fake news, and political fake news in particular. So we, the traditional press, have got an even bigger obligation now to actually verify and fact check so that we are more trusted than that subjective tweet that's fired in the middle of the night with no verification, no fact checking, no context, no arranging the story, curating the story along with other relevant facts and concepts.
Thandeka, thank you very much for your time. That was my colleague and the editor of the economics team, Gqubule-Mbeki. Well, on the line we